Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. How does AWS describe the infrastructure in its availability zones? Variable and unpredictable. Limited and unstable. Basic and unreliable. Highly available and fault-tolerant. Availability zones offer highly available and fault-tolerant infrastructure. What is the term for the point-of-presence locations where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users? Edge locations. Regions. Availability zones. Data centers. Edge locations are the point-of-presence locations where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users at low latencies. Which term refers to a distinct location within an AWS region that is engineered to be isolated from failures in other availability zones? Availability zone. Edge location. Region. Data center. An availability zone is a physically separate data center within an AWS region, designed to be isolated from failures in other availability zones to provide high availability and fault tolerance. What is the primary benefit of using AWS local zones? Reduced latency. Increased redundancy. Enhanced security. Lower cost. The primary benefit of using AWS local zones is reduced latency, as they bring AWS services closer to end users in specific geographic locations. What is the primary purpose of AWS regions and availability zones? Improved performance. Increased availability and fault tolerance. Cost reduction. Enhanced security. The description states that AWS regions and availability zones offer increased availability and fault tolerance. What characteristic distinguishes each availability zone from others in AWS? Uniformity. Shared resources. Independence in power, networking, and connectivity. Interconnectedness. Each availability zone is independent in terms of power, networking, and connectivity. In which type of scenarios are AWS local zones particularly useful? Applications with high computational requirements. Applications with global user bases. Applications with strict regulatory requirements. Applications requiring low latency access to AWS services. AWS local zones are particularly useful for applications requiring low latency access to AWS services, such as real-time gaming and multimedia content delivery. What is the primary benefit of using AWS edge locations for content delivery? Lower cost. Enhanced security. Reduced latency. Increased redundancy. The primary benefit of using AWS edge locations for content delivery is reduced latency, as it brings content closer to end users, improving response times and user experience. What is the term for a point-of-presence location where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users? Availability zone. Data center. Edge location. Region. An edge location is a point of presence location where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users, reducing latency and improving user experience. How does AWS describe its infrastructure in availability zones? Limited and unstable. Highly available and fault-tolerant. Variable and unpredictable. Basic and unreliable. Availability zones offer highly available and fault-tolerant infrastructure. What is the primary purpose of AWS edge locations? To cache content and improve the performance of AWS services for end users. To store backups of data in different regions. To enhance security features of AWS services. To provide isolated testing environments for AWS services. AWS edge locations primarily serve to cache content and improve the performance of AWS services for end users by reducing latency and improving response times. What ensures the highly available infrastructure in AWS? Instances. Availability zones. Regions. Data centers. AWS availability zones offer highly available infrastructure. What is the purpose of AWS local zones? To extend AWS infrastructure to geographic locations closer to end users. To enhance security features of AWS services. To provide isolated network environments for testing. To create redundant copies of data in different regions. AWS local zones extend AWS infrastructure to geographic locations closer to end users, enabling low-latency access to AWS services. What is the primary factor driving the adoption of AWS wavelength zones? Demand for ultra-low latency access to AWS services for mobile applications. Requirement for global redundancy. Need for enhanced security features. Cost-saving initiatives. The primary factor driving the adoption of AWS wavelength zones is the increasing demand for ultra-low latency access to AWS services for mobile applications, enabling developers to create responsive and innovative experiences for users on 5G networks. What ensures the scalability of operating production applications in multiple availability zones? Fault tolerance. Geographic dispersion. Resource pooling. Redundancy. The description implies that operating production applications in multiple availability zones ensures scalability. What is the term for the AWS service that provides a content delivery network service to distribute content to end users with low latency? Amazon S3. Amazon EC2. Amazon Route 53. Amazon CloudFront. Amazon CloudFront is the AWS service that provides a content delivery network service to distribute content to end users with low latency, leveraging edge locations for faster delivery. What is a characteristic of each AWS availability zone's infrastructure? Shared resources. Limited redundancy. Centralized control. Independent power, networking, and connectivity. Each availability zone is independent in terms of power, networking, and connectivity. What is the term for a fully isolated section of the AWS cloud where you can launch AWS resources in a virtual network? Amazon EC2. Amazon Virtual Private Cloud. Amazon RDS. Amazon S3. Amazon Virtual Private Cloud is a fully isolated section of the AWS cloud where you can launch AWS resources in a virtual network that you define. In which type of scenarios are AWS wavelength zones particularly useful? Applications with global user bases. Applications requiring real-time responsiveness for mobile users. Applications with strict regulatory requirements. Applications with high computational requirements. AWS wavelength zones are particularly useful for applications requiring real-time responsiveness for mobile users, such as gaming, augmented reality, and video streaming. What is the primary purpose of AWS wavelength zones? To improve security features of AWS services. To provide ultra-low latency access to AWS services for 5G applications. To replicate data across multiple regions for redundancy. To create isolated testing environments for AWS services. AWS wavelength zones are designed to provide ultra-low latency access to AWS services for 5G applications, enabling developers to build innovative and responsive applications for mobile users. What is the typical size of an AWS wavelength zone in terms of geographical coverage? Global coverage. Within a country. Across multiple countries. Within a city. An AWS wavelength zone typically covers a specific city or metropolitan area, providing ultra-low latency access to AWS services for mobile and edge applications. What is the term for the point-of-presence locations where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users? Edge locations. Regions. Data centers. Availability zones. Edge locations are point-of-presence locations where AWS CloudFront caches copies of your content for faster delivery to users at low latencies. Which component of AWS infrastructure provides redundant power, networking, and connectivity? Regions. Instances. Availability zones. Data centers. Availability zones provide redundant power, networking, and connectivity. What is the smallest geographical area in AWS infrastructure? Edge location. Data center. Availability zone. Region. An availability zone is the smallest geographical area in AWS infrastructure, designed to be isolated from failures in other availability zones. Which AWS service is closely associated with AWS edge locations for content delivery? Amazon RDS. Amazon CloudFront. Amazon EC2. Amazon S3. Amazon CloudFront is closely associated with AWS edge locations for content delivery, as it uses edge locations to cache and distribute content to end users with low latency and high transfer speeds. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.